understanding or respecting the fact that every creature has just as much right to be here as us. And not everyone agrees with that, but that's my point of view, that we're all custodians on this planet, and because we have more power and influence than the other species, it's incumbent on us to look out for them, and and for those of us that can, to be a voice for them, because they can't speak for themselves.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 429 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen. Today's conversation is a powerful reminder of what's possible when passionate creatives come together with a shared purpose. My guest is Margot Raggett, the visionary behind the Remembering Wildlife book series, an extraordinary collaborative effort that has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for conservation through the collective power of photography. Margot has rallied over 280 of the world's leading wildlife photographers to contribute their work to these beautiful books, each focused on an endangered species. From the savannas of Africa to the forests of Asia, this project is making a real-world difference, and it all started with one photographer's desire to help. If you've ever wondered how your photography can support something bigger, or how a single idea can grow into a global movement, this episode is just for you. Let's dive in. All right, Margot Raggett, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited for this conversation. It's a topic that I'm really passionate about myself, and I love to hear other people who are also passionate about these subjects. So I think it's going to be a fun one.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot to be said.
Yes. So for people who aren't familiar with you and what you do, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Well, the condensed version of my life story. So I am based in London. I used to work in PR in the city for 20 years, and I fell in love with wildlife photography along the way. I left that former career and decided I wanted to become a wildlife photographer. So I dedicated myself for 4 years trying to build a career in that. I worked as a regular camp photographer in residence in the Masai Mara for 4 years on and off. So lots of experience out in the field. I think I've spent more than a year and a half of my life in the last decade out in the wilds taking pictures. But along the way, I became disillusioned with just taking pictures of animals and not giving back to them. I felt like I was doing them a disservice. So after a particular incident, which I'm sure we'll come on to, I founded the Remembering Wildlife book series in 2014. And now I'm back mostly behind a desk in London again, which is what I was trying to escape when I became a photographer. But I'm doing that with a purpose. So now I spend 90% of my time on a computer, and then if I can get out into Africa, I was just in Kenya a couple of weeks ago, I will. But yeah, sadly, behind the computer more than I'd like nowadays.
How did your passion for Africa start?
It was a girlfriend of mine who I met at university, who'd grown up in Kenya, and she moved back to South Africa as soon as she could. And a group of us went out to have a girls' holiday in South Africa, and we went to the wine district, which I highly recommend. And she said, if you're coming all this way, you might as well go on safari, because you never know, you might never go again. And that first game drive I did in the Sabi Sands in South Africa, I saw a newborn giraffe, and I could not believe it. I was like, you just put that there. That didn't just happen. And I was completely entranced with nature and wildlife, hooked immediately. And as soon as I got back, started planning my next safari and kind of went from there. That girlfriend of mine takes entire credit for everything I've ever done since, because she's like, if I hadn't made you come, your life wouldn't have taken this path. But so yeah, it was the wildlife and nature that pulled me in, and once I experienced it, there was no looking back.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's interesting that you said that the longer you spent time in Africa and seeing and photographing the wildlife there, that you felt more and more compelled, like you needed to do something more with the work. And that's something I'm hearing more and more photographers talk about, especially wildlife photographers who, you spend a certain amount of time photographing these amazing creatures, and then there's something that clicks inside of you that just makes you go like, man, I feel like I just need to do more with this than just take these awesome pictures. I'm curious, kind of like, what was that breaking moment for you in terms of when that clicked for you?
Well, I think we're all on a journey. As I said, it just started occurring to me over time that, I was taking from these animals. And if you think, photographers who photograph models, they pay those models to have their picture taken. And yet wildlife photographers take pictures of these animals and they might argue that they're paying park fees to be there. But really, they're not giving anything back to those individual animals in any sense. So it was just a kind of growing perspective. But then a particular incident happened for me in 2014. I was staying in a camp in Laikipia in northern Kenya. We got woken up in camp at like 4 a.m. by the sound of lots of hyenas going crazy. So, I mean, it was a lot of hyenas. So at first light, the guide and I went down to try and take a look at what was happening. And what we found was an elephant who had died, and he still had his tusks intact rather. But hyenas had started to eat him, and he was a young elephant, about 14 years old. So I said to the guide, what's happened? Because young elephants don't just die. What's happened? And so he explained to me at that particular moment, the poaching crisis was absolutely at its peak. The number of elephants being killed every single day was shocking for their ivory. And so he put together that what had likely happened is a poacher had shot the elephant for its tusks, even though they were only small, with a poisoned arrow. The elephant had managed to bolt away from the poachers, but the poison would have gone through his system, and so he died anyway. And the day before, I'd been photographing elephants, a wonderful scene with baby elephants playing, and suddenly then I was just seeing a pointless life having been taken away, and particularly as I hadn't even got the tusks, and I just was filled with kind of impotent rage that this had happened, and I just thought, no, not on my watch. I'm not having this. I'm not having it. How dare you just murder this animal? And so for me, that was just a real turning point, because say I'd had this feeling, what can I do? And then I had something to kind of coalesce around and to focus on. I thought, what I want to do is, if I can do anything to stop one more elephant from suffering the painful death that this one would have gone through, I'll have achieved something, and started to mull on what I could do and how I could go about that ambition.
I love that. I mean, I don't love the story because it's incredibly sad, and it infuriates me that as a species we have such low regard for other animals, no matter what their role is in the planet. And it's a complicated issue in terms of why those individuals are poaching and all of that stuff. And not sure we have time to go into a whole history lesson on why poaching exists and what is being done about it. But maybe this is a good segue for you to talk a little bit about your journey in creating the Remembering Wildlife series. What inspired you to start the project, and did you ever expect it to grow into what it is today?
Yeah, I mean, so as I said, that turning point for me was seeing the poached elephant, and I decided that I wanted to do two things. I wanted to raise awareness of how much poaching was happening, and the rate of poaching, what the implications were for that at that point. And so at that point, there's around 400,000 elephants, and they were being poached at 30 to 40,000 a year. I mean, just horrific numbers. So I'd seen an interview with Jane Goodall, and she was saying at that rate, within 10 to 15 years, there might not be any left in the wild, which was such a shocking thought. And I have since learned that's a bit simplistic. And of course, elephants are being born, and in some places there's maybe arguably too many elephants, and in other places there's too few. But the theory that we might get to a point where they've been wiped out on our watch was something that really stuck with me. And so that's how I came up with the concept of what became Remembering Elephants. I thought, well, can we therefore do a book which is celebrating what these animals were like in the wild at this moment in time, as if we were looking back on them, as if we have, allowed it to happen? Can I shock people at the prospect that that could actually happen? And I thought, well, how can I go about doing this? I take some nice pictures and I have a few followers on social media, but I'm not famous and no one's going to buy enough books just by me, apart from my mum. And, she hasn't got enough money to buy enough books to make a difference. But I realized, because I'd been working out in the field for quite a long time at that point, that I knew quite a lot of the other big names in wildlife photography, because when you drive around the Masai Mara that much, you start to see the same faces, you start to chat to each other. And I, in particular, had kind of become quite close to a photographic couple called Jonathan and Angela Scott, who have both won Wildlife Photographer of the Year independently. They're the only couple that both sides of the couple have won that award. And I'd had many long chats with them about conservation and what was happening in the world. So they really inspired me too. And I thought, well, if I could put together a book of, say, 50, that was my ambition, photographers, and they gave me a picture each, then we'd really have something remarkable. And it had never been done. No one had got lots of independent, great photographers to collaborate on a book like that before. So there's Wildlife Photographer of the Year, but it wasn't specialized on one species. There was no book on elephants that had been done by the best. So I started tentatively approaching Jonathan Angela Scott, other photographers like Federico Veronese, and saying, look, I've got this idea and would you give me a picture? And each of them said, a great idea, of course, yes. And so once I started with that, the ball started rolling. And the first photographer who I wrote to, who I didn't know personally, but I just got his email from someone, a mutual friend, was actually another of your podcast guests, Marcel Van Oosten. And I wrote to him and said, you don't know me, but I've got this idea. I've got some great names behind it already. I've got a great background. So, in the professional world of PR and marketing, so hopefully, you'll put your trust in me. I will do a good job with your image if you'd be prepared to let me use one of your images. And he said yes too. So then, it kind of came together, and I decided I wanted 50 photographers. I didn't know 50. So in those early days, Marcel would say yes, and I'd say, who else do you know that might have a nice elephant picture we could use? And I was Googling pictures and finding them on the internet and writing to the photographers and saying, I love this picture. Would you mind if, you submit it and we could put it in this book? But over time, that snowballed, and I got to the point where more people wanted to be in the book than we could actually fit in. So that's a whole different problem I have nowadays. But yes, I was managed to get that 50 for that first book.
I think you had mentioned to me in our correspondence that you also had like Art Wolf in there, who has also been on the podcast. And I was curious. So the original idea for the book was, to celebrate and raise awareness for the elephants. How did you couple that goal in terms of like, what would the book do? Like, are you raising the money for a specific purpose, or kind of walk us through kind of the nuts and bolts of what the book was aimed to accomplish?
Yes, no, thank you. So it was twofold. As I said, I wanted to raise awareness because I felt that not enough people knew that poaching was happening, and I was as guilty as anyone of that. I worked in a camp in the Masai Mara, and it's very easy to go to a fancy safari camp and not know the reality that over that hill, round the corner, on the other side of the fence, there's poaching, there's human wildlife conflict, there's poisonings, there's all sorts of things going on, because the safari world, it's not part of what the vision they're selling you to know that that's what's going on. You just want to go and sit in your camp and have your gin and tonic and watch the animals wander past. So now I knew that, I wanted to raise awareness of it, but I also wanted to raise funds for projects trying to protect those animals. So passionately, I didn't want to just do one part of the puzzle, because I felt that, raising awareness, maybe speaking to a lot of people who are already converted, isn't going to do as much as actually giving money to put boots on the ground. And so in those early days, I've become much better educated over the years, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but I was quite simplistic. I was like, okay, I'll raise money, I'll give guns to the rangers will shoot the poachers, job done, we're going to solve poaching. And I don't think we've ever funded a gun in anything we've done, and we've just given out our latest donation. I think we've funded 74 projects now, so a lot of projects out there doing different ways of trying to tackle the same problems. But I also, in those early days, I had a good sense that I would be able to make a success of the book and raising awareness of the book and marketing the book I didn't have the contacts on the conservation side of things that I have now. So in those early days, I partnered with the Born Free Foundation. So I had actually been donating images to them for a number of years at that point. They had contacted me saying that we love your work and could we use some of your images in our marketing. So I knew them and I got back in touch and said, look, I've got this idea and would you like to partner on it? Because what I didn't want is to raise money and then have it go astray, which is very easy. There's a lot of corruption everywhere in the world, of course, but particularly in some of the countries that needed the most help when it came to the issues we were trying to face. So yeah, I partnered with them in that early years to make sure the money went somewhere worthwhile. And I was able to therefore sit down with them and learn from them and say, well, look, how do you tackle poaching if it isn't just giving out a gun? Tell me more.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question, because I imagine that, you said, oh, all we need to do is get some guns and get some guards and the problem goes away. Obviously, it's a lot more nuanced than that. So I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit about how the project has evolved, what you've learned along the way, and kind of, you said you've funded like 74 projects. So like, what are the different lanes that you've kind of tried to tackle this complex problem through the raising of funds with the books?
Yeah, well, so we've covered 9 different species now. So I'll tell you them very briefly. So elephants, after elephants, we did rhinos, great apes, cheetahs, lions, African wild dogs, bears, leopards, and tigers. I think I've got them all there. But what has been remarkable is that again, from the outside, I would have thought that a lot of the issues would have been very different, but they're really virtually all down to one cause, which is humans for a start. And then it's either humans trying to trade in their body parts for some reason, whether it's for medicinal or trophy, it's, maybe consume their body parts, or maybe have conflict with those animals, not want them to be where they are, and try and destroy those animals in some ways. And you have to understand the motivations, and you touched on this when you touched on why poaching happens. Again, obviously, it isn't as simplistic as there are just bad people who want to poach. Right. Poaching will happen, or trading in body parts. Usually the end kind of criminal who's doing the killing of the animal makes very little money out of that, and there are organized crime syndicates who are organizing all of this that then funnel the trade off to wherever it goes. So trying to understand the pressures and the needs on the end criminal, why they're doing that, and how you can try and prevent that, through to getting involved in, we've done a little bit with organizations that try and do criminal prosecutions of poachers, through to then on the human wildlife conflict, again trying to understand and not judge the reasons why people find it hard to live alongside those animals, and to help them and enable them to do that. So it's very well for us, me sitting in London. I'm not quite sure. Where are you sitting?
Oh, I'm in Southwest Colorado, so I'm in the mountains.
Okay. Well, so you probably have a bit more dangerous predators around you, bears, maybe?
We've got bears, mountain lions. That's kind of the extent of the predators around here. And then, of course, we have lots of elk and deer, Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, which is actually, interestingly enough, that's a huge problem in the United States and Canada, in terms of human conflict as well, because of sheep farming, or sheep herding. The traditional sheep that we use for grazing in public lands here in the United States carry a very potent respiratory disease that is incredibly lethal to Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. And so whenever the populations of bighorn sheep come in contact with the sheep that we're grazing, they typically end up causing a lot of death and disease amongst the native populations of bighorns. And so that's like a whole other thing of like understanding the sheep herders' financial needs and economic reasons why they're sheep herding in these public lands full of bighorn sheep, and then trying to convince them to maybe not graze where the bighorn are. And so I'm like, this is a problem across the world, right?
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, what I was going to say, and say you've got much more kind of on your doorstep in terms of that kind of issue than I have in London. The biggest predator I have to face here is an urban fox, which
Right.
is an inconvenience rather than something that could actually kill us. But yeah, I mean, even in the UK, we've had issues with badgers and a lot of kind of dispute about badgers being culled because they might be infecting cattle as well. So we have that to a lesser extent. But it all comes back to, as I said before, it's inconvenient for us humans who think we want to order the world around what's convenient and what works for us, and not necessarily understanding or respecting the fact that every creature has just as much right to be here as us. And not everyone agrees with that, but that's my point of view, that we're all custodians on this planet, and because we have more power and influence than the other species, it's incumbent on us to look out for them, and for those of us that can, to be a voice for them, because they can't speak for themselves. So, but yeah, so human wildlife conflict for all sorts of reasons, whether they can infect your wildlife or whether they can kill your cattle or sheep or goats, or whether they might endanger your life or the life of your children or your loved ones. It's difficult and we can't expect people to live alongside those animals without help. So we've done a lot of human wildlife conflict kind of mitigation work, I would describe it as. And then there's also a lot with children as well, and understanding the influence that children and educating children can have on their impacts on as they grow up, and also on their elders. So I remember as a child, we had a presentation at school about baby seals being clubbed together for their skins, and going home and in tears telling my mum off. This was like in the 70s when fur was very popular. She just got her fur coat for Christmas and was very proud, and I was tearfully explaining to her why fur coats were not acceptable. And so again, children can have a real impact. So there's a lot of education programs we've done across the world, actually, particularly in Africa and India as well. So there's so many. Every single species has a slightly different set of issues depending on where they are in the world, but there's huge commonality between them. And one of the things I quite enjoy but also get frustrated about, so I enjoy pointing it out and get frustrated, and would like to spend more time on in the future, is conservation is very splintered. There's lots of projects tackling the problems almost as if they've thought about them for the first time, and there's not enough sharing of best practice. People kind of, the organizations who are fantastic organizations, but they'll try and come up with a solution themselves rather than looking elsewhere. And I think that's because there's not enough sharing that goes on. It's getting better, but I'd like to see more of that, and I'd like us to facilitate more of that as well, because if someone has come up with a great idea, then everyone should be using it. So I have done some of that, particularly I was just in Kenya, as I said, a few weeks ago, revisiting an area where in the South Rift Valley. I was there about 4 years ago, and I was actually there with a lion hat on, because we'd just done Remembering Lions, and we'd made a donation to this project called Serralo. And on my way to the airstrip to leave, someone said to me, "Oh, that farm over there, the poor farmer, all of his watermelons were trampled by elephants like the night before he was going to harvest, and that was his annual income, all devastated." And I said, "Well, have you tried beehive fences down here?" So the elephants have been pioneering the use of beehives. I don't know if you know about beehive fences. I'll give you a quick explanation.
Not
So,
at all. Yeah.
okay, so these are really cool. So elephants hate bees, and people ask, why do elephants hate bees? And all I can imagine is because if you get a bee up your trunk, you're going to be in trouble.
Oh yeah. I
So
can see that.
yeah, exactly. So elephants hate bees, and elephants can knock over pretty much any fence that you could build around your farm. But if you have beehives there that swarm, elephants will react to the sound of swarming bees, and they will run completely in the opposite direction. So
Makes
the
sense.
theory, yeah, so the theory is that you hang beehives on a wire that is actually quite loose, so that if the fence gets knocked, the beehive swings, the
Hmm.
bees get irritated, they swarm, and then the elephants leave. And by giving training to farmers and beehives to farmers, they are motivated to look after the bees because they also will get income from the honey that they can sell, and actually protect their crops at the same time. So I was able to say to this project, do you know about this idea of doing beehives? Have you even tried it in this area? I don't know if it would work here. And so 4 years later, I was just walking down a 5 kilometer fence that's been erected with donations that we've given, and we're protecting 1,000 farmers, smallholding farmers, with that beehive fence, which is remarkable. And they've actually had to fine tune it because it turns out beehives can't cope in the extreme heat. So they had to put them in more shady spots in the forest, and in the more open areas, they're using a mixture of solar lights. And then I was even asking them, have they looked at chili fences, which is another similar idea. So you have fences that grow chilies. Again, elephants are quite sensitive to chili oil, so they don't want to knock into chili fences. So again, these are ideas like we've funded chili fences in Malawi before, but I'm like, well, have you not tried them in Kenya? And so, they're all different approaches to the same problem, which is how do we stop elephants trampling crops, which means then there will actually be conflict and farmers will go out and try and spear them or poison them to stop them from trampling those crops. And I'm constantly amazed at the ingenuity of conservation organizations to come up with solutions to these things. But there's so much to be done. There's a lot of space where elephants are. So yeah, we have to keep going.
Yeah, and I feel like so much of the conservation work like effectively starts at trying to understand the people who are most impacted by the presence of the wildlife and why they might be wanting to eliminate the wildlife or why they don't like the wildlife or whatever. And then it's like, okay, how do we solve those problems for these people? I mean, you think about like in the rainforest of Brazil, like a lot of the habitat loss that's happening, and then that causes issues with wildlife there. And a lot of that's just because those people don't have an income, and they found that if they burn back the crops and they grow the types of crops that can gain them the most income, or they can raise cattle there. So it's like it's an economic issue. It's like, how can we uplift the economy of these people so that they don't feel the need to burn the forest down in order to survive on a day-to-day basis? And I think that approach of seeking first to understand the people who are doing the thing is probably the most effective. I think there's one caveat to that, and that's trophy hunting. Like, I don't know that there's any way to understand those individuals other than like, how can we find a different way to satiate your ego or whatever it is driving you to do this? But I think that's the solution, right? Is just understanding the problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I agree with you on trophy hunting. I think the challenge is that we need to find other ways to raise the finance that trophy hunting currently raises to replace that revenue.
Right.
And I met a hunter unwittingly one day at an event in South Africa, and started chatting to him, and then was kind of realized that was his thing. And I said, you do realize that, instead of paying your 25,000 to kill that lion, you could still pay the money and not kill it and say, I have saved the life of that lion, perhaps even put a collar on it. So I have bought the life of that lion, and you would be conserving it. You don't have to kill them to still give that money. And he just looked at me like yeah.
Or here's a thought, like take that 25,000, spend 15 of it on a camera and a lens, take pictures of it, and then donate the other 10,000 to the organization that helps protect it. And then you get to still, quote unquote, shoot the lion. It's still the same type of things. Like, you have to go look for it. You have to find it. You have to understand it. You take a picture of it. You preserve it forever, just like you would with a trophy. I mean, to me, it's like all the same things built into wildlife photography is kind of satiating all the same needs that people have without killing an animal in the process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This hunter looked at me like I was insane when I suggested this. He just could not compute. There was just kind of bewilderment on his face. But it is really important that we find alternative ways to replace that finance. And to be fair, some of the places that hunting takes place are not suitable for photographic tourism. So you wouldn't get people being able to go into those places. I've been to some of them that are so kind of thick bush and full of ticks and other things that you wouldn't be able to get beautiful images that we would aspire to have. So I'm quite interested in the idea of carbon credits, and this is something that's growing up a lot more. And I'm hopeful, optimistic that could be something that would provide income for those areas in a different way, and that would be fantastic if we could. And actually, just to pick up on your point about talking about South America again, when I was in Kenya a couple of weeks ago, I visited an area, a forest on the edge of the escarpment of the Masai Mara that tourists and photographers don't go to. But it's a remnant rainforest, and there are giant pangolins. There are only about 20 to 30, they think, left in this remnant forest. But the forest is being chopped down because land was allocated to individual landowners in the last decade or so. And so people have fenced off their land and they're gradually chopping it down so that they can find ways to make revenue from it. And what means is, tracks of it are just disappeared, stumps. The wood has been sold off for charcoal, and then they want to either graze on there, or agricultural companies are coming along and offering them money to lease that land to grow crops on. So the project I was visiting, which is the Pangolin project, who are there ostensibly to protect the giant pangolins that are so rare and few in that area. I mean, the giant pangolins are virtually impossible to see anywhere, but this little pocket of them is remarkable, and yet within 5-10 years they will be gone if they don't do something about it. So what they're doing is they've done memorandums of understanding with a number of the landowners to give them a retainer effectively to not chop their trees, with a view to building a longer term contract that they will all sign up to collaboratively to lease the land. And then that leasing payment would come from a mixture of carbon credits and or kind of fundraising from the pangolin projects. But we were having long discussions about how projects like theirs can't compete with an agricultural offer necessarily, that so you're trying to preserve land, that you're having to be in the open market against commercial reality as well. And how do we fund that? It's and that's across, as you say, across the world. It's the same issue. And we even went into this forest where we ended up at a piece of land where the guy was taking money to not have his trees chopped down, and we found it had all been cleared in the last months, and they'd last been there, and there were charcoal burners there. They were making charcoal, and this guy had signed up to agree not to. So the battle is enormous, and we can't underestimate that. But on a positive note, there are many brilliant projects like that project, maybe using one species as a halo to protect the whole forest. So the pangolin forest are doing it for pangolins, but actually the elephants use that landscape, buffalo use that landscape, lots of other animals do as well. So you're saving an ecosystem with the headline of whatever particular animal you're going in there on. And I think it's our job, my job, and thank you for having me on the podcast, because then you're helping us to spread the word about them, to encourage them and give them as much funding and publicity as we can to keep going, because I saw a lot of very disheartened people when they saw that day, and we need them to brush themselves down and try again tomorrow to talk to the other landholders and make sure it doesn't happen. So it's a thankless task, conservation, and I have had my heart broken so many times by seeing great organizations doing great work and still things go wrong, still things they're let down or an incident happens. But if they give up, then there's no hope for any of us.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I just want to take a quick pause and tell you about the tripod that I trust for my landscape photography, the FLM CP30 L4 II. Finding the perfect tripod is like finding the perfect pair of boots. It needs to be sturdy, reliable, and lightweight enough to carry all day without regret. That's why I use the FLM CP30 L4 II. This tripod strikes the perfect balance of height, weight, stability, simplicity, and price. It's rock solid in the field, yet compact enough for long hikes. And here's the kicker, it's half the price of tripods from Really Right Stuff, while matching them in every critical way. So, if you're tired of overpaying for a tripod and want something built for serious landscape photographers, check out FLM. I trust mine in the harshest of conditions, and I think you will too. Find out more by visiting the link in our show notes or by visiting flmcanada.com. Okay, let's get back to this week's episode. Maybe this is a good segue to go back to talking a little bit more about the book series. So you've got over 280 photographers have donated their work to the Remembering Wildlife series. And I believe your books have been held up by presidents and rock stars and movie stars. What impact do you think these books are going to have on conservation and awareness, or what impact have they had on those issues?
Well, I mean, obviously, the direct impact is because those people have helped publicize the books. We've sold the books, or we've sold 54,000 copies. And so we've just given out our latest donation, and that's taken us to £1.2 million that we've given out as of this week, which is 1.55 million US dollars. So over $1.5 million US dollars has been given out to all of those organizations. So the actual practical giving out of funding to organizations that desperately need it is something that I'm very proud of. But I do think our reach has gone beyond that. So even if, not everyone has donated or done something, we are educating a lot of people through our books and through even pictures who just see Ricky Gervais holding the book up, or Chris Martin from Coldplay. They kind of are aware of what we're doing. And then we get resulting publicity on top. So I used to work in PR. This was my day job. You amplify your message by getting people to write about you. So countless articles from in-flight magazines around the world to TV interviews and podcasts like this as well. So it's keep spreading the word, keep spreading the message, keep making awareness. You never know where the next opportunity is going to come, and the next person who becomes a conservationist. And I've met people who said that they've become rangers, or they've changed their career because they've been inspired by what we're doing. So I think we can just put out what we're doing and hope that gets amplified elsewhere. But someone did ask me once, what can you specifically say the Remembering Wildlife series has achieved? And I had to reflect on that and say I can't say anything. Because to say we might have done something to help the local community, to persuade them and help enable them to live alongside animals, and then one rogue player still went out and killed a lion, regardless. So it's to say it's an endless task. But what I can say is it's a giant forest fire that we're all fighting, and if we were not here, we'd be one powerful hose less fighting that fire. So we stand alongside all of the other organizations who are doing the same, and our hose is hopefully making a difference.
I love that. So my understanding is that the Remembering Wildlife series is now working on the 10th book. What can you tell us about this next edition, and what makes it special?
Well, it's going to be our biggest book yet. And people have been suggesting to me for a while that it was time that we did a kind of retrospective and pulled together some of the best images from the previous books into one. So maybe people couldn't afford to buy all 9 books so far, but they'd love to kind of have a look at, a lot of the images from across there. So that's what we're doing. We're putting some of the best images from previous books, and honestly, the selection is remarkable. One, it's really hard for us
Right.
as an editorial team to choose them, because we already had great pictures, and then you're trying to say, how can we choose, from 60, like just 10 images? It's really hard. But I'm actually using that then as a kind of stealth way to introduce pangolins to a wider audience and to educate and hopefully entrance people with pangolins and their story, because not enough people know what pangolins are, or would buy necessarily a book just on pangolins in the way they might lions or tigers or elephants. But hopefully they'll buy this book because it's going to be remarkable in the quality of what's in it. And then, they'll learn about pangolins as a result, because pangolins really do need our attention. So they're also known as scaly anteaters. And so for people that don't know, they look like a giant walking pine cone that does have scales. They are highly secretive. They're mostly nocturnal. Most people never see them. I have never seen one in the wild, which irritates me greatly. I think they just avoid me. I'm always the person that I turn up in camp and they're like, you should have been here yesterday, or the day after I leave, they message and go, you should have been here today. But despite that, I don't hold it against them. And I actually got to spend some time with a couple of rescued pangolins who've been rescued from the trade in South Africa recently. And when they're in that kind of rehab situation, they have to be walked every day manually. They're very temperamental pangolins. If you just put them in a cage and kind of put ants and termites into that with them, which is what they eat, they will not eat them. They will eat them. They will only eat them if they forage them themselves. So you have to put them out and you have to walk with them and let them forage and keep them going until they've had enough to eat. So it's really hard work walking pangolins. They properly motor these things. They're really fast, and they're on a mission and they're going through. But so I got to kind of walk with them, but also like pick them up and help weigh them, because they weigh them before they take them for a walk. They weigh them afterwards. They weigh their poo so that they can actually see how much is going in, how much is going out, if they're gaining weight, so therefore they can assess what their health is. And I fell utterly in love with them. I had no idea that they are sweet and they have little personalities. I think they're closest for me to a pet cat in the way that their personalities are. So some of them are incredibly curious and will nuzzle into you. Some won't give a damn and kind of standoffish and kind of, try and push away from you. And everyone I know who's now worked with or studied pangolins agrees, like they've all got little personalities. And they're just charming, and yet they are the most trafficked mammal in the world. Over 1 million have been taken into the trade in the last 10 years, they estimate, which means more than any other animal. And they're taken for their scales for use in Chinese medicine. They're taken for their meat. They are also then suffering from issues around electrocution on electric fences. So the forest I was just in Kenya, another consequence of farmers being given land and putting electric fences up is that pangolins will hit the electric fence and their natural reaction is to curl into a ball. That's their instinct to protect themselves, so that they're covered in scales and they're a ball. They curl around the electric fence and they keep holding on until they're electrocuted to death. It's horrific. So many issues that are facing them, and I want to educate the world about them, make everyone fall in love with them, and then if they buy this 10-year book, then the funding from that can go back to projects such as the one I just mentioned that is trying to save forests, which will also protect other animals, and then other projects which are trying to remove the electricity from the lower wires so pangolins don't get electrocuted, and then others that are working in rehab to actually, when they are confiscated from the trade, try and get them back out into the wild as best they can. So there's a lot of great work going on to try and save pangolins, and we need to sell these books in order to help fund that.
Brilliant. We'll make sure we put lots of links in the show notes so that people know where to get their hands on the book. I was curious to ask you another line of questions because you seem uniquely positioned to answer some of these questions in terms of the impact of over-tourism and photography trips and safaris and in some of these natural areas. And like, you've worked in the Masai Mara for a long time as a photographer and a guide. What are your thoughts on how photographers and tour operators can become more responsible when working in these environments?
It's a huge topic, and I think it's up to all of us to kind of really stop and think about the impact of that we are having when we take images. And my great fear is that more and more with social media, more than ever with social media, people are chasing the likes, and the way that they get likes for their images is to get the more unusual perspectives, to get closer to the animals, and they're doing that totally disregarding the fact that this animal is a sentient being that deserves respect and space, not just because it deserves it for respect and space, but also for the safety of those taking the pictures. Because make no mistake, when an animal conflicts with a human because the human made a mistake of getting too close, invariably the animal is destroyed as a result if it's seen as a problem animal. So I just actually responded to something that was posted a couple of days ago about criticizing, and I backed them up and agreed about people targeting a particular big tusker in Amberselly called Craig, who more and more people are trying to get close up and do really wide angle images, and particularly on foot. So where he is mainly hanging out is private land, so it's not within the confines of a park where there are park rules that prevent you from getting down on foot and taking pictures. So because it's private land, people are getting out of the vehicle, descending, getting close to him and trying to get these pictures. And touch wood, so far, he's been a fairly gentle giant, but elephants, like any wild animal, are unpredictable, and heaven forbid he charges and gets irritated by someone and they get killed, he would then be in the firing line himself. And I was visiting a camp who have a sister camp in Amberselly, and they were saying that the guide was saying it's a huge problem for him because he would take people, his guests, to see Craig, and other guests are getting out of the vehicle and doing what they shouldn't for safety reasons, every reason I said before. So he's explaining to his guests, no, we don't allow you to do that because we don't agree with it. And his guests are therefore giving him a hard time. That impacts on the atmosphere in the vehicle. It impacts on feedback and reviews. It impacts on the tips that he will personally get. And that just isn't right. He should be tipped for telling people not to get out of the car, not the other way around. Right. And I think people just don't think about it. And I worry that photographers are trying to get, to get those likes. And every situation is different. And I have been in situations where, I might feel I could see the animal is relaxed. I know the behavior. I've spent so much time, with those animals that I know I was not causing any harm by being a bit closer to an animal. But if I take that picture that I've done and put it out on social media, I am encouraging other people to get that close, and they won't always know whether that's safe to do or not. So I think it's incumbent on me, and I think it's incumbent on photographers with big followings and who are renowned to set a good example. And so I have images. I have an image, for example, we were in a vehicle in Marna Pools, so we weren't on foot where you can be in Marna Pools, but in a vehicle, and an elephant mock charged us and got pretty close, and kind of a lot of dust was thrown up. And as always is the case, if someone else is driving, I'm in the car, I just carried on firing my camera because I'm lined up, so I got the pictures. So I got a pretty spectacular image of a charging elephant, kind of, and I've never shared that. I never would, because I don't want to encourage other people to think that that's a cool shot to get. And I've got, other images where I found myself in a situation like that. I just wouldn't do it. And say I've seen images of lions that are mating, which is a wide angle where they've got really low and really close to that situation. And again, I've been in situations where I've been less close, taking pictures of mating lions, and one of them just went for us. He lost his cool. He started chasing the vehicle. I mean, we literally had to scream in reverse and get out of there. And so you just don't put yourself in a situation where you can't get out. And yet I've seen pictures which are celebrated and have been shared very widely, that, if that lion turned, that photographer would have been dead. So, it's really important that people think, about safety, about respect, about distance, about not just park rules, because often these will happen outside of park rules or where there's no rangers watching, so they think they can get away with it. And I just think it's irresponsible on every level. And we've got to get away from just needing likes and think if you really care about those animals, they're not just an object like a rock for you to photograph, but you actually genuinely care, then think about all of that when you come to kind of line up what image you want to take.
Yeah, and it's too bad too because there's a certain big name landscape fine art photographer that has his work. He's constantly coming to where I live, and he has his work in the gallery there. His last name rhymes with Marrow. Just gonna put that out there. And he's done a lot of, in my opinion, if you follow the work and you put yourself in his shoes as a photographer and understand how that image was captured, how that situation was created in terms of putting models in danger, therefore then putting the animal in danger, or like feeding foxes in order to get them to come out and to get really close-up shots of them. Those are all things that we know that that particular person is doing, and yet they are celebrated and elevated in the art community and by galleries. And I actually even had a very heated email exchange with a local gallery here about the ethics of this particular individual. And I sent them articles about their behavior and the things that they had to do in order to achieve that photograph. And they were like, yeah, we reached out to them and they said that that was just a PR smear campaign. And I'm like, you don't understand the perspective as a photographer. Like, we understand how those images were created and the things that that person had to do in order to get those images. So, I mean, I think part of the problem is like this systemic issue of kind of elevating and celebrating the wrong ideas.
Yeah, and you'll note that that particular photographer has never appeared in any of our books, despite them personally offering to me that they could be. And I know that person, and you know, on a day-to-day level, they're perfectly pleasant to chat with, and he's been very supportive of encouraging and saying we've done a great job. But I can't include images by people that I don't think are going about things the right way. So, and that goes for, there are other photographers who would like to be in our books who I have just deliberately avoided for the same reasons. And it's, you know, over time, as I've become more confident in what we're doing, you know, I've become a bit more outspoken about these things. But say whether it's the photographers I choose to include in the books or the images, I'm very, very conscious. I will not put images into our book that I think are taken in a way that I don't think is right. So again, you won't see images of a cub being carried towards camera, for example. So you'll see lots of people will chase the picture of a leopard cub being carried in the mouth towards the camera. I won't do that because I know, having been out there, that the way to get that is the leopard is walking and you scream to the side and then you line up so that it's having to walk towards you to get that particular image, and then actually you are blocking it potentially. I've heard of plenty of stories of vehicles getting in between cubs and adults, cubs getting lost even. I've heard of cheetah cubs being driven over because photographers are trying to get close enough to get pictures of the cubs, and you can't predict the behavior of that animal. So the driver didn't set out to run over a cheetah cub, but it happened because they were too close. And a pet peeve I used to have, well, I still have, but I've seen less of it recently, is cheetahs jumping on vehicles in Africa as well, which they will try and do to get a vantage point. Naturally, cheetahs want to go up a termite mound, and then some learn that if they could climb on the top of a vehicle, they could get a good view. And yet, actually, then there was a whole thing of people wanting selfies of the cheetah on the roof of their car where they could kind of do a back picture and there's a cheetah behind them. All you need is that cheetah to bite down on the neck of one person, you know, and that cheetah is going to be put down, or you need it to slide off the vehicle. I had a fight once with a Maasai driver where he had allowed a cheetah to go up on the roof so he could get pictures, and we were all parked at a distance. And then we heard on the radio rangers were coming in and were going to be arriving soon. And this cheetah is still on the vehicle, on the roof of his car. So he's got his pictures for his guests. And now he's looking nervously up because he knows he'll get fined if he gets caught. So then he turns the engine on and starts to kind of wait to see if it will move. And then he starts to drive, which obviously could just mean the thing will slide off the back, break its leg, it's dead. So I demanded my guide, who was very uncomfortable about me doing this, but I didn't care, that we drive over there, and I yelled at the guy and said, "You stop now or I am reporting you to the rangers." And he said, "Well, I'm going to get, you know, a fine if they see me." And I said, "I've got your picture, so I am giving you, if you drive, I'm giving it anyway, so you're just going to have to sit there and wait." And we sat with him till the rangers arrived, and he was spitting at me, and he was like, "You know, you're a Mzungu, a white person, that, you know, you don't love them like we love them. They're our cats." And I'm just like, I'm not putting up with your nonsense. And that was, I'd say, towards the end of my time in the Masai Mara. I haven't been in the main reserve for 3-4 years now. I was just in the Triangle. I got so upset so often about behavior of humans in the Mara that I could not bear it. I did a post sitting at a crossing waiting for wildebeest to cross one day, and everyone had been sitting for hours and hours. Wildebeest are very skittish before they'll cross. They've got to be very relaxed and kind of feel confident they can go across. And a guy got out of this vehicle after 3-4 hours, and we have all been sitting around waiting. He literally got out in front of everyone and walked up to a termite mound and started taking a pee in front of everyone. So the wildebeest took one look and scattered, and the whole crossing was called off. Nature was totally interrupted by his behaviour. So I took a picture of him and put it on Facebook, going peeing man, and explaining why this was not the way to behave in that situation. And so that takes me on to your question about over tourism. That can be the implications. I don't think the main reserve and the Masai Mara is being managed correctly by any shape or form. I don't know any photographer who does. Most photographers I know are now pulling out of the main reserve and going to the conservancies or maybe the Triangle. And it is a tragedy because I spent such a long time, and I would always be in camp out of season. So I used to do January, June and November, and could drive for days where you wouldn't see any other vehicle. And it's the Garden of Eden. It's the most remarkable place in the world, but it's heartbreaking how you'll find yourself in a situation where one cheetah can have 90 vehicles revving their engines and driving around it to get there. It's just unacceptable. And that the management of that needs to be changed, absolutely. So yeah, over tourism, it doesn't help. The money is not helping those animals anyway in that situation. There are plenty of good places where it is being managed properly, and conservancies is a good way to look at it. But yeah, it's something that aggravates me greatly, as you can tell.
Yeah, I mean, I've been unlucky, I guess, to say that I haven't been to Africa yet, but these are all issues that I have always been curious about in terms of like, how do I photograph that place ethically? And it seems to me like it really requires you to have a lot of deep knowledge and have people there with you that know the behavior, know the situations. Can you what are some other ways that people can, like if someone's like, I'm going to go to Africa, I'm going to go on safari, like how can people equip themselves with the knowledge and the foresight in order to capture images in a more ethical way?
Well, I think, going with a good guide or a good tour operator is a really great start. Or even if you want to, choose a particular camp, if you have a camp in mind. But, I'd say all of our photographers practically are also photographic guides. So that they'll all sell you a safari if you want to go with any of them. So I would start by looking at the kind of photographers you admire, who you think you could learn something from. And then I would ask them questions, just as you ask these questions, say, I have concerns about this, what would you think about that, and see what their responses are, and hopefully if they are ethical and have their head switched on to where they might go, they'll explain to you and make suggestions as to what would suit you and how. But then whatever situation, if you're with one of them or you just book independently to go to a camp and you're with local guides, use your own common sense and your gut feel. So I have been in plenty of situations where I have asked the guide to leave, and it's hard. And I acknowledge I have been out enough. I've seen enough, lion, leopard, cheetah, whatever, that for me, if I decide to drive away from a situation, it's not the only lion I've ever seen in life. So it's easier for me to do that. But equally, I will just say, I do not feel comfortable with this. These vehicles are harassing this animal. When you sit down with the guide at the beginning, and the guide will always, or should always say, what are you after? What are you hoping for? Say, I don't want to be in that situation. And so it's, if you're going to the main reserve and the Masai Mara, it's almost like forget trying to photograph any of the big main charismatic species, because you'll be in that situation probably, unless you go really out of season. So then try and say, I want to concentrate on the less popular animals, and go that. But then if not, do your research. If you go to conservancies, they have much better. So the conservancies around the Masai Mara, they have much more strict rules. You can only have 3 vehicles on a sighting. So you should be in a place where actually, you won't have that harassment of the animals. You should be with a camp that is ethical. So do your research and ask your questions before you go. But good photographic guides are worth paying to go with, and not just going to a camp. Even if you're a great photographer and you don't need them to explain how to use your camera, they should know the animal behavior and the lighting situations to try and get you lined up for the best shots. So for example, we would, with a cheetah, and we can see a cheetah is walking across the plains, I would be looking and saying, there is a termite mound over there. As I explained, they usually want to get up high. So can we go and drive to the other side of that termite mound and be lined up ready, and I want the sun behind it because I want this, so I'll drive ahead to get there. Or I've got another shot that I often show in talk. It's of a male lion with a young cub. So that situation, we arrived and there was a pride of sleeping lions with a kill under a bush in the midday sun. So they were all asleep, and all the vehicles lined up and kind of parked right next to these sleeping lions. And I looked at it, so there's no shot there. So I look around and I say, okay, there's a water hole over there. And what I know is that after eating, lions need to drink because, the meat is very salty, and so they always need to drink a lot. So it is likely that the lions are going to go over to that water hole. So let's actually go and park around the other side of the water hole so we can anticipate the straight line, because lions walk in as straight a line as they can, so that where they've come from the bush, they'll come to the water hole. So we'll park on the other side, and got the vehicle lined up, sat there waiting. Sure enough, half an hour later, the male lion came in. And then a blessing shortly after, the cub came in next to him, and they kind of had an interaction where they looked at each other, and I had the reflection, and all the other vehicles started going, oh God, and driving around to where we are. We had the only position that could get that shot. So I always talk about it. There's a difference between taking and making shots. And, if a vehicle just drives you up, and you take a shot, that's one thing. If you think ahead, what behavior might happen here? Where can I get the best light and position? Then you're starting to make those shots. And it doesn't mean that sometimes things won't happen unexpectedly. Of course they do, but, forethought. And if you don't know that behavior, then if you're with a photographic guide who gets images you admire and who thinks in that way, they should get you into that position. So yeah, that would definitely be my advice.
No, that's great. Yeah, in terms of the anticipation part, I think that's one of the things I love most about wildlife photography is like the more you understand the behavior of the animal and understand the situation, the scenario, you can put yourself into some situations to where you can maximize your likelihood of getting a really interesting photograph. The company I work for, Munch Workshops, I mean, we do quite a few wildlife-centric tours and things like that. And it's always really important on the ones that I'm leading to talk about those safety issues and about those ethics issues, especially as it relates to like not endangering the animal or putting us into a weird situation where the animal feels threatened and things like that. So I think it's really important to go on trips with people who actually are thinking about those things. Because I understand for a lot of people, like you said, it's like maybe a once in a lifetime situation. You're on a safari in Africa. You want to get as many photographs as you can. And you're constantly asking like, why can't we just go over there, get the photo that I want? And it's like, you need to listen to the guides because like there's a reason why we're doing it a certain way. And it's not just because we're trying to keep you from getting a good photo. Like there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely insane. And it's different when you're trying to help photographers than just for normal guiding as well. And so not every camp, will give you a guide that has photographic knowledge or experience or, kind of thinking about lighting and things like that. So again, yeah, all of that needs to come into play. But say you also, I think, need to sit down, or guides need to sit down to begin with, say, I will not put us in these situations, and try and explain a bit better. But I've seen not necessarily one guest that I am guiding, but with other people, guests getting upset about things, and the guide needs to be strong in their conviction as well about what they think is right and wrong, and not be bullied by the guest. And at the end of the day, the ethics of how they behave, is what will stay with them and their reputation. You shouldn't give in short term to kind of bullying guests by any means, but hopefully by educating the guests better to begin with, you won't be in that situation.
Well, we've talked a lot about some of the bad, negative things that are going on. The World Wildlife Living Planet Report 2024 states that wildlife populations have declined by 73% since 1970. What are some of the most pressing conservation issues that you've seen firsthand? And most importantly, what gives you hope?
Because in terms of the most pressing, as I say, it's that's pretty wide. The most pressing issue, there are too many humans. And so, we're taking over more and more land, whether it's for us to live on or for us to convert for agriculture or livestock in order to feed ourselves. So, at a kind of macro level, we can all make our personal choices about what we eat and what environmental impact that has and how much land is taken up for our kind of eating choices. But that's a different argument. But I think the projects that I am most encouraged by are the ones that do give me hope, that are making a success, whether it is kind of educating the next generation and bringing children along that journey of understanding that that they need to protect wildlife, and ones that are finding successful ways to give value to local communities to make it worth their while to live alongside the wildlife, for sure. So I'd say I'm quite excited by the idea of carbon credits, and I hope we're going to see more of that. I have seen huge amounts. There's so much land that is out there that is still wild currently, or even has the potential to be rewilded. And I suppose that's another quite exciting area that, there are plenty of reserves, say in South Africa, that have been rewilded that were formerly agriculture. So Amakhala, for example, was a collection of farms and then it's been rewilded. There's lots of examples of that going on. And I was just in Swalu, an amazing place that in South Africa as well, but they have effectively protected the land, and that's a huge philanthropic family-run organization. It's the Oppenheimer family, but there's so much land that has been protected for wildlife, and they're using the tourism model. So it's a pretty expensive place to visit, Swalu. But the landscape is remarkable, and what they're doing is protecting that. And I drove from Swalu to 5 hours out to the Kalahari Wildlife Project, which is the place I saw the pangolins that we were walking. And as soon as we left the confines of Swalu, we were seeing solar farms, mining areas, just kind of desolate land, and it really showed me the difference of how that land can be protected. So I think the fact that there's more and more people caring about nature, interested in wildlife and wildlife photography, people trying to find ways to use, whether it's tourism, carbon credits, other ways to kind of recompense communities so that they can live alongside. There's so much work, and there's so many brilliant people out there doing great work and determined to make a difference, that I think there is hope. And your kind of followers who obviously have photography in their hearts and enjoy photography is a great way to give back to wildlife, and say that there's lots of ways to do it ethically. You get the mental benefits of being in nature and spending time with that wildlife, and then also kind of giving back to those species as well. So yeah, there's lots to be hopeful about, but there's many. It's a big old forest fire that we're fighting, as I said.
Yeah, absolutely. So for people who are listening, who are like, yeah, I really would like to make a difference, or I want to support the Remembering Wildlife Project, what's the best way for people to get involved?
Well, start by going to our website, which is rememberingwildlife.com, and on there you'll find our shop to buy all of our books. So one of the great things about our books for photographers is that we have selected some of the most remarkable pictures by some of the best photographers in the field right now, and I also work really hard to choose a really good selection and variety of the types of images that are shown. So from kind of portraits to landscapes to action to slow shutter speeds to close-ups of details and everything in between. So they can be pretty inspirational as well, particularly if you are, say, taking your first trip to Africa and you think, well, what if I see an African wild dog? How do I photograph them? Here's a manual on how to do it with all the different types of shots that people have imagined and come up with. So our books are very educational for people who want to be inspired as to how to take images, but we also have we just make them beautiful, so they're well received by, as I say, from 10-year-old children to their grandmothers. Everyone just loves these books because they're so beautiful. And then all of our profits that come from buying those books go back to projects that are carefully selected by us, because I spend a lot of time educating myself about the best projects. So in a way, I've kind of done the hard work for you. You just buy a book and then know that the funds are going to go to really good causes.
Perfect. Well, I only had one more topic that I wanted to ask you about, and maybe we can make that a little bonus episode at the end about AI and AI's impact on wildlife photography. But to conclude the main section here, who do you recommend for the podcast? Who are some people that my listeners would love to hear more about?
Well, I mentioned them earlier, but as I said, Jonathan and Angela Scott are a remarkable couple who both have won Wildlife Photographer of the Year individually. Their work is beautiful, but they have lived their lives giving back to wildlife. They are patrons and ambassadors and champions for so many great projects out there. I've learned practically everything I know from them about conservation. So from blowing your socks off with their beautiful work to kind of, filling you in on how important conservation is, there's no one better. So yeah, I hope they say yes.
Brilliant. Well, Margot, this has been really fun.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And sorry, I've got a lot to say on a lot of topics, but
not at all.
hopefully some people have enjoyed it too.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me for another great episode. It was an absolute honor to speak with Margot about her incredible work with remembering wildlife and the powerful impact that her book series has had on conservation efforts around the world. If Margot's story moved you, I highly encourage you to support the project by picking up a copy of the latest book. Not only are you getting an inspiring collection of wildlife imagery from some of the best photographers in the world, but you're also directly contributing to real change on the ground. Before we go, I want to give a shout out to our friends at FLM Tripods. If you're in the market for a new tripod or ball head, they've got some of the best gear out there, built to last and trusted by serious photographers. FLM is offering listeners of the podcast 10% off your entire cart when you use the code House of Pain at checkout. Visit flmcanada.com. That discount is good through October 1st, 2025, and you can use it as many times as you like. And of course, a huge thank you to our newest Patreon supporters, Joseph Ray, John Sexton, and Bill Henderson. Your support helps keep the podcast going. If you're finding value in these conversations, please consider joining the community at patreon.com/fstopandlisten. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.